Bore da everybody and welcome to our session this morning. So this is an update session. It will form more of a briefing session, but we will try and give some, as Tim said, some time for Q&A, questions and answers at the end. Myself and Kath, obviously part of the curriculum team in Central South, and we've been delivering updates as well for our local authority partners, for our own staff or school leaders, particularly at this time, because the professional learning related to Curriculum for Wales went on hold for a little while due to COVID, and we'll come back to that a little bit more in a moment. But now in earnest, we've reinstated the programme and we've had really good engagement from our schools, and we're very welcome to have governors here this morning, so thank you very much. So those are the objectives for this morning: to reflect on the key policy documents and their importance in supporting schools, to consolidate understanding of Curriculum for Wales and the other curriculum reform that enable it, to gain awareness of our professional learning offer and the support that we have available in the region. And all of this is obviously, as I said, set in the context of we're in COVID. Lots of this work hopefully will be post-COVID, and the amendments, the realisation, the attention that has to have been given to blended learning and all of the health and safety, etc., that has been going on in schools, and the significant impact on society and the well-being of people have been taken into account, and hence why the programme was paused in the first instance. But as I say, there has been an appetite, particularly in recent months, for this professional learning and this momentum again to September 2022. So the next slide just reminds us of all of those enabling reforms. I'm not going to spend too much on this, and you may have seen this before, but when back in 2014, 2015, and then the Pioneer Network started in 2016, there were a number of reviews undertaken of our education system in Wales, and what was decided that we would have whole-scale reform, because in reforming a curriculum doesn't stand alone in a school, and therefore reform needs to be wide-scale. So you can see there, I'm just going to mention them very quickly. So the national approach to professional learning to ensure that all practitioners and governors have their professional learning needs met in order to realise the curriculum, and also that there is equity in the quality of that professional learning. Schools as learning organisations, because we know that a school acting as a learning organisation with robust leadership and with robust self-evaluation and inquiry and vision, that's what enables really strong schools to develop. The ALN reforms, obviously absolutely pivotal, and they are now moving along. Again, they were paused for a little while or extended for a little while, but I'm sure you'll be aware of some of the updates there. And I know Liz Jones held a session for governors, which was really well attended recently. The professional standards for teaching and leadership, they've been around a few years now, and schools will have been using those and working towards those. The National Academy for Education Leadership was established, and they are obviously very active in the system, supporting school leaders and working with us and school to ensure that leadership and the professional learning for leadership is appropriate to support our leaders in Wales. There have been significant reforms with our IT provision, so our teacher education, and we work very closely with schools and with our IT providers on ensuring the high quality provision for students and newly qualified teachers, and obviously that has had significant impact during this period. And the other three parts are obviously really important. The Curriculum for Wales we'll be talking about mostly today. Obviously, school-to-school working enables all of this to happen. There is a vision in our national mission document of a self-improving system, and that has actually always been at the heart of Central South's working with our self-improving system, with our Central South Wales Challenge. And the evaluation framework, everybody is always really interested in. There is a consultation document that was recently published, and obviously assessment, accountability, evaluation are of huge interest to the system, although that is not something we will be focusing on this morning. Thank you, Kath.
Fab. So what we do when we run sessions for head teachers, senior leaders, mid leaders, really anybody, is just take a pause to just reflect and acknowledge the fact that we are still, of course, within the phases of an organisational response to a pandemic. The pandemic is still with us, and schools have felt the effects of the pandemic to varying degrees. So what we do is just look at, you know, some of you who might have had change management training would be used to the tick of change, that very well-known way of model for looking at the stages, particularly the emotional stages attributed to organisational change. And so an academic from New Zealand, he applied Kubler-Ross's tick of change to the way that schools and settings were responding to COVID. And I think probably as governors, you've seen perhaps how that initial crisis of we just have to keep everybody safe, minimise impact on any equity, and ensure there's some kind of continued learning. When we talk with head teachers, we look at perhaps this being the fire break, that moment of thinking, oh gosh, this is not over, this is going to keep happening to us. But so many schools that we're engaging with at the moment through training and coaching and any number of our programmes are really now within this adaptation, even the opportunity phase. They're seeing there are some things that they've been able to glean from their response to the initial lockdown and lockdown 2 and fire break, and they're taking those things forward. So they're looking now at what happens next, and they're bearing reform in mind when they move through that opportunity phase. So that's something that you might be able to discuss with your senior leadership teams at school as well. What are those opportunities? How have we adapted? And then making sure that that reflection really does allow for a continuous cycle of evaluation and improvement as we move on. So in and amongst our COVID response, what we have is, oh, it didn't like that for some reason. What we also have is that the bill, the Curriculum and Assessment Wales bill, has now proceeded through the Senedd. So if we'd spoken to you back in January or February, we'd been saying if you do agree in any way with the reform, please let your MPs know. There was nervousness, I suppose, on Welsh Government's part as to whether the bill would actually pass through the Senedd, but that's passed successfully in March. We've gone through another stage called Stage 4 of the legal process. We won't bore you with the full ins and outs of the legal process, but the thing that you need to be aware of as governors is that following that process of passing the bill through Senedd, the legislation section of the guidance on HUB that's available to you all to see, that then is going to be, and when we say rewritten, it's going to be updated following certain minor amendments that are required legally, and that won't be sort of republished with a big song and dance. It will just be that live on HUB there will be a change sitting behind the section. So what I'm just going to do for you now is show you where that is, because that's really important for you. So if we go to HUB, and of course you don't need your HUB username or login to access this. Curriculum, I'll put it in English for you. Curriculum for Wales sits here. And if we have a look, these are the big pieces of guidance that, of course, we need to work through, particularly school practitioners need to. And this is the section on legislation. So some of the wording, some of the guidance within this whole section will be altered from September. So just so that you're aware of that. Okay, so there are additional work streams. So we know that the legislation section will be amended, minor amendments. Natalie said that we've got this evaluation, improvement, accountability framework that's had a consultation. That consultation has just ended, but there are links here because Tim will make the presentation available for you following the session. So if you want to go in and have a look, hopefully you had access to these things through your governing body, and your head teacher shared them. But these were some of the qualifications, consultations, some of the things that are in the system at the moment at a national level. Something that's really interesting here is the policy insight events. So these events have been really interesting. That they held, the minister herself has held a few Q&As. They're a 1-hour live session that to try and bring policy and practice a little bit closer, to try and bring Welsh Government closer to those in schools. And the most recent session that they held was looking at schools as learning organisations, that framework. They've got one coming soon. The links are within there for you on the professional learning journey. So that would again be really relevant for you as governors. So if you had the time, either pop into one of those live, or if you follow through this link here, you'll see that there's a recorded version for you then. And there's more. So as well as our framework and the guidance that you could all access on Hub, it was acknowledged when that was published, January 2020, there was still additional work streams that just hadn't reached the completed stage yet. So if you have a look at all of these things, careers, work-related experiences, the hotly debated relationships and sexuality education element, these are all elements of Curriculum for Wales that have to be delivered by schools and settings, and there's just further guidance to be released for these. So we've got some additional consultation on some of these that will be released 18th of May, and that will be released through Welsh Government's newsletter disc. It'll come through our school bulletin as well, and actually in the notes section of this presentation you can see links. So if you do want to have your say on relationships, sexuality education, perhaps on enabling pathways, the early route to learning, then you have the opportunity for that, and certainly we're encouraging your schools to have their say. But these are all there won't be huge changes, but there's further content, further guidance that will help schools with each of these elements when they start designing their curriculum. Okay, and then what we do is bring everything back to this. So I'm just going to hand over to Natalie for this second.
Thank you, Kath. So this was a document that was written in collaboration between the 4 regions, Welsh Government, Estyn, and obviously Cos Wales also. And it was written pre-COVID, and then again it was paused and then amended slightly with COVID in mind. So the working title of this was Shared Expectations. The actual title now is Curriculum for Wales Journey to 2022. And what it does is it gives school leaders and the whole system a pathway, a journey towards September 2022. What it does again is it talks about phases, and it talks about the key work that should be happening in schools during those phases. But it also recognises that curriculum realisation is not a linear process. Schools will be at different starting points, and actually schools will revisit some of these stages throughout the journey to 2022 and beyond, because remember we talk about September 2022 only being the start of the implementation of this in earnest, and we know particularly for secondary schools that is only year 7. For primary schools it is all year groups, but that doesn't mean that on that date the curriculum has to be perfectly formed and never to be changed again. We do expect it to be continually refined, evaluated, a reiterative process to ensure it's meeting needs of learners. So what we've just done is spent a lot of time in that engagement phase, and what we find is schools will jump to designing, planning and trialling, because what they want to do is get going with the teaching and learning. But actually we're trying to stop and pull schools back to that engagement phase, because the visioning and the change management in that engagement phase is absolutely essential. And even if schools have started designing and planning and trialling, it's really important to go back to that engagement phase with the whole school community. And all of our professional learning in the spring term was related to that engagement phase, and particularly around vision. What is a school's vision? What is the cluster vision? What are individual departments and AOLE's vision for Curriculum for Wales? And in order to think about the vision, and in order to discuss as a school community with all stakeholders that vision, you need to really understand the framework that is on Hub and the guidance that is already there. So that whole phase has been about making sense of the framework, making sense of the curriculum, and then really thinking about what does it mean to our school, to our setting, to our learners. The professional learning now, and the phase that we've moved into next, is designing and trialling. And Kath's just going there to show you on Hub where some of this information is.
So just so that you're aware, again, I think it's obviously Tim can put the links to documents in the chat, but I think, you know, for you to become more aware, more familiar yourselves with the framework. So it's, again, no login required. You've got the guidance here, and the Journey to 2022 document is there. So that, you know, for so many of our schools, that has become the handbook, their most trusted partner in this process, because it helps reassure them of the level of activity that they're undertaking in their schools. So the Journey to 2022 is there for you.
Thanks, Kath. And again, you know, in the forward, our Minister has written that, mindful of COVID, some schools may be further along that journey, some schools less so. And as Central South, we're making sure our professional learning offer and the support and the discussions between our improvement partners, our strategic team, and school leaders and practitioners supports that journey. So this is just an overview of our professional learning offer. So as we've just said, we've been supporting particularly the engagement phase. So we've led sessions on leading change, developing vision, understanding and getting to know the model, and there was a governor playlist that was released that you may have already engaged with, or post this session you may want to look at, which helps to make sense of the Curriculum for Wales framework and guidance. This term there's some sessions starting actually tomorrow on how do schools create time and space for staff and practitioner professional learning, because obviously previously in the curriculum there was a national curriculum that was published, and that gave schools information on curriculum design. And the vision of this is that design will be at a school level. So this may be, and it will be for most practitioners and school leaders, new knowledge and skills that they need to develop. Therefore, professional learning is essential in order to them to design and trial and sequence that curriculum. Pedagogy as well is something we're looking at releasing soon, because we want that to sit alongside curriculum. So obviously all the time when we talk about curriculum, the actual definition of curriculum is much broader now. It is all of the learning experiences within a school, and pedagogy then is the teaching and learning that sits alongside that. So it's really hard to separate them, but actually when we look at theory, we look at theory separately, and then we think, how do they influence and how can schools provide that professional learning to ensure that what is taught, why it's taught, and how it's taught are really thought of and meet the needs of the individual school.
And so what we've got, again, I think I'll take you to this, show you where it is on Hub. So we talked about the legislation section, and there's going to be some updated guidance released there now in September, but it's still worth you familiarising yourselves with that anyway. The Journey to 2022 document that helps pace the activities in school, and then here's the implementation plan. So 28th of January the Welsh Government released this, and it just sets out, ensures the roles and responsibilities of all of the education sector. So across the 3 tiers, tier 1 being policy, being Welsh Government, tier 2 being the regional consortia, the Leadership Academy, Estyn, Inspectorate, Qualification Wales, and then tier 3 being schools. So how are tier 1 and tier 2 supporting the implementation? So there's a lot there, and it explains what roles and responsibilities we have as regional consortia. And actually it's really interesting that as regional consortia we have 14 roles and responsibilities, ways that we're going to support our schools to be able to realise the Curriculum for Wales and its enabling reforms. You'll see them here, whereas Welsh Government have just 4 and Estyn have 1. So they've really put the regional consortia at the heart and centre of providing support and guidance and challenge to our schools. So with that being in mind, you will potentially see and hear much more of us, but hopefully it means that you can also encourage your schools to realise that we're here to support them, and that there's a lot of training and support that we can give them, whether that's through our national programmes or on a more bespoke level. So that's our roles and responsibilities. So it's not something you need to know inside out, but it would be good to be aware of that. But what it's all about is this. So we're just going to give you a couple of moments quiet time just to read that. This is taken directly from the opening paragraphs of the framework. So this is really about consolidating our understanding of the framework, and what does Curriculum for Wales require of us? Require of us as governors, require of us as school improvement advisors, or of our head teachers, of our practitioners, support staff. And this talks about the aspiration. So previously our national curriculum, it prescribed the content, it told us what as teachers we needed to teach, in what order, but it always fell short of articulating why. So the vision that we have now at a national level is these 4 purposes. So the 4 purposes are the shared vision for our education system. And to realise that vision, schools, of course, must design, adopt and implement a curriculum to fulfil the requirements set out in legislation. So that's a massive shift, because what that requires is we've got the shared vision for the whole of Wales, but as part of that engagement phase, we're asking schools to create their own vision. So it has to reflect their own communities, their own settings, their pupils, their carers, but also it has to align to that shared vision of the 4 purposes being the reason why we educate children and young people in Wales. So it is about these things. We realise you can't see that. The reason that we show it as this poster is because what's been happening over the previous few years, the 4 purposes themselves, the headlines of ambitious, capable learners, enterprising, creative contributors, ethical, informed, healthy, confident individuals, those have been very tokenized, and you will see probably in the schools that you support that there are posters of those everywhere. But what's been apparent, that we're missing some of the meaning, some of the nuance that sits behind what is it truly, what does it mean for a young person to develop, to become ambitious and capable. And so what we're encouraging our practitioners and our schools to do is to take it back to source and make sure that they engage with all of these sub-characteristics, these attributes, because all of these things are what it means to become ambitious and capable. Or all of these things are what help support children and young people to be enterprising and creative. So we just need to make sure that they're aware that it's not just the headline statements, that our practitioners are engaging with these sub-characteristics. And of course, then the 4 purposes are our aspiration, what we want children and young people to be, how we want an educated 16-year-old to look like. But then our AOLEs, our areas of learning and experience, our subjects, our disciplines, those provide the context then through which, so we can't possibly become ambitious and capable if we haven't had, rigorous, high quality learning within and across subjects and disciplines. So that means knowledge rich, skills rich experiences being crafted in our learning design right from nursery through to 16. So that's where we've got this interrelationship between the 4 purposes, articulating our vision, being our aspiration, and the AOLEs or subjects and disciplines still having great importance within our curriculum. And that's something that we're always trying to get across to our practitioners, to dispel some of those myths around Curriculum for Wales being about skills and not really being rooted in knowledge. The difference is that actually the prescribed knowledge, the skills and the experiences that our children and young people are going to be exposed to is really going to be decided at school level and not at a national level. And that's a huge shift. So this is just to illustrate the model of Curriculum for Wales. So we spent a lot of time with our schools going through this. So Natalie said that within the Journey to 2022 document, lots of our schools, they see the framework and they've gone through all the guidance. You might have done the same as well. They might have presented to you on AOLEs and what their plans are. And then what they want to do is go straight to planning. So they're going to say, what topics are we going to use? How are we using our local area? What stuff? But what's happening is we then are missing out one of the most fundamental parts of Curriculum for Wales, which is the design of a school or cluster level curriculum. So what we've got to make sure is we've got Curriculum for Wales, which now sits at a much higher level than we've had previously. So we've got the framework, and it is a framework. It's not the curriculum itself. It just gives us the bare bones of what we need to, as schools across Wales, align to, so that there's some consistency across Wales. But actually then the job of deciding what children and young people need to know, in what order, when, how, that comes into this school level curriculum, and that's where we're asking now practitioners to become curriculum designers. Previously, the national curriculum did that for them. It sequenced what they had to teach in what order. And now we're asking practitioners to really critically analyse what they're teaching, why, does it support learners to become ethically informed or ambitious and capable, and so we're spending a lot of time over the next year on that complex theory of learning design, on the way that cognitive science can help inform curriculum design, so knowing what children and young people are actually capable of cognitively at any point in time, child development, understanding the origins of learning, what children are able to do based again on science, before then we say, okay, so what are we going to introduce in terms of concepts or knowledge or skills, and when do we revisit those? And we need to really look across a cluster for that to be very effective across 3 to 16, to make sure that we are continually building step by step from that nursery, and we don't hit these sharp sort of drop off a cliff of transition points where we go from year 6, we were really on this trajectory, and then we stall for a little bit in year 7 while we sort of recap or even repeat what happened in year 5 and 6, then we move again. We need to see that we're stepping all the way along, and so it's everybody's responsibility, whether you're a secondary practitioner or primary, to look at the 3-year-old and track what it is they're going to learn, experience and do right through to 16. So there's an explanation of that model. It's a 2-sided poster, and of course the full purpose is the why. It explains why we're doing this. School level curriculum is where then our schools, and you'll be part of this, are going to say, what does it mean for our learners? What do they need to know in this context? And then the bit that practitioners get super excited about, that I still get excited about, oh, how am I going to bring this to life, you know, in my classroom? So then I can choose what topics, what themes, what specific activities. I can ask my pupils to come and influence some of that learning at that point. But the big piece of work is, first of all, deciding these non-negotiables, what everybody across that cluster is going to be exposed to, learn, revisit. Before then, we can all go off in our own classrooms and bring that to life. So what we're going to do now is interrogate that a little bit and maybe be a little bit cheeky, because we've got a true-false quiz, and some of the statements we're asking you to identify if they're true or false. Sometimes the answer is within the nuance, but that's something that's really important, because particularly Natalie started talking early on about the importance of a shared language, and I think everybody across CSE talks about that now. She set a trend, because what we've realised is, unless we all know what we mean when we say skills, or when we say curriculum, or when we say pupil-led, then, you know, what often happens across a system is huge variance, because we're not actually sure we're talking the same language. So what we've got is a few statements here, and we just want you, just as a reflection, or if you want to write them down in a notebook, you can, but a little bit of, do we understand the framework? Where are the gaps? And of course, we'll support you with some further resources that we can signpost you to if you are concerned that you've got gaps in knowledge. So the first one is, the 4 purposes must be assessed and tracked for all learners.
And Kath, just to add, we built this quiz around the myths and misconceptions that we hear every day still in the system. So this is there to sort of maybe break some of those myths, and some of those myths and misconceptions are very minor myths and misconceptions based on a misunderstanding of our language, but the unintended consequences then of what happens if that misunderstanding happens can be quite significant. So as I say, lots of this is based on some of the myths and misconceptions that we know are still in the system, and making sure we do have a proper understanding when we're talking about these things.
And interestingly, we worked with a professor from Scotland, last week who looked at curriculum design with us, and even he was talking about the some of the issues within the Scottish curriculum was that there's these false dichotomies. People perhaps talk about skills when really they mean knowledge, and they're misusing or interchanging terminology. So a really key thing for us is to make sure that we have got a shared understanding across the system. So for example, with the 4 purposes, oops, I went too quick. The 4 purposes do not need to be assessed and tracked for all learners. Now, there's a lot of text there, and of course you can have access to this presentation afterwards, but just so that you know, this isn't sort of made up answers, that this isn't my version or Natalie's version of the answer. Wherever possible, we take the answers directly again from the source. So this is what you would see in the framework. So the 4 purposes, they're our aspiration. They're what we want an educated 16-year-old to look like, and all of the characteristic sub-attributes that we want them to embody, having been exposed to a high quality curriculum from age 3 to 16. But the 4 purposes can't exist, they can't be developed in a vacuum. So it's the knowledge and skills and experiences taught within each subject, each discipline, across areas of learning experience that provide the context for the 4 purposes. So we couldn't possibly expect our young people to become ethical, informed individuals if they haven't actually learned, been exposed to a knowledge-rich curricula, an experiences-rich curricula. So it's really important that actually the aspiration is the 4 purposes, but they are not something that we're going to tick off. They're not something that we are ever going to be judging in a summative way, but they keep our conscience at planning. Are we planning and delivering for the right reasons here for our young people? So another one is that the curriculum should be pupil-led. And it's always interesting when we do this, and sometimes we do it interactively with a live quiz, and it's incredible. Even at some of our schools who are very confident, the head teachers tell us, yeah, they're ready to go to curriculum design. And so many of these are really confused. So the curriculum should be pupil-led. Actually, as opposed to just saying, no, it shouldn't, what we say is, this is a nuance really, pupil influence is really different to pupil-led. So as we know, and as I'm sure you're going to be knowing very keenly, because you're going to go through this process in terms of supporting your schools, curriculum design is really complex. It's something that lots of our workforce haven't been involved in previously. So curriculum design cannot just be handed over to pupils. You know, we can't assume that pupils would know what they need to know or what they don't need to know and in what order. You know, curriculum design is based on a really important foundation of understanding cognitive science. So from age 3 right through, what is it scientifically our children and young people are capable of at any point in time? Looking at child development, again, what are they capable of? What can they do, and how can we progress them? And then, of course, how do we sequence all of that they need to learn, do and understand? So what we always say is curriculum needs to be led by practitioners, highly skilled practitioners. But of course, if we think of the 3 circles, that model, when we get to the final model of saying, oh, how are we going to bring the concept of democracy to life, or how are we going to now teach algebra, then we might start to consider pupil voice coming in there and influence of, you know, how that is delivered. But we've just got to be really careful there that the curriculum is still crafted by the practitioners themselves. So another one, all areas of learning experience should be given equal time. Is that true, or is it false? So for that one, it may be they should be given equal time, but actually that sits outside. There are no powers for Welsh Government or Regional Consortia or Estyn to stipulate anything to do with school timetabling. So some schools may choose to restructure their schools and reorganise along the lines of areas of learning experience. They might want to create heads of areas of learning experience, for example. Some schools may not want to change at all in that regard. Some schools have heads of departments, subject coordinators, and they may still continue on that basis. Similarly, timetabling, that's something that we're going to explore with our schools when we run the curriculum design modules. which start this May and will continue for some time. And what we look at there is examples of timetabling. Timetabling, particularly at secondary school, is often called the dark arts. It is so complex, but just because most schools do it a certain way, or a software that schools use suggests a certain way, doesn't mean it's the only way to do it. So what we do is discuss alternative options. We discuss how timetabling can bring out the best in experiences that our young people have in schools, but it's very much school level decisions. So that might be something that you as governors have conversations with your schools about, but it's certainly not something that will ever be stipulated. It's really important, of course, literacy, numeracy, digital competence, they need to be considered across all of the school timetable for all teachers. But actually, you know, we're not ever going to see equal numbers of music lessons as we would see of history lessons or English lessons. But it's certainly a really good point for you to have a discussion with your schools about.
What I would like to say there, Kath, is that all of those areas of learning have equal importance. So they might not have equal timetable in hours, but they certainly have equal importance in the Curriculum for Wales framework.
And what we're hoping for with that is that, of course, or what we've been promised, that the new evaluation, improvement, accountability arrangements that you know, we don't know what they are yet from Welsh Government, but that there is a commitment that it's not any longer just about those core subjects of English, maths and science. Previously, because they were so heavily scrutinised, they were so heavily measured, they became drivers in our school systems, whereas now we're saying, you know, all areas of the curriculum have got equal importance, but as Natalie said, it doesn't mean that means equal time would be given. And, you know, that's quite exciting, looking at how schools will create their timetables to make sure that it is broad and balanced across the 6. So we know we've got 6 areas of learning and experience. Our schools aren't going to be structured alongside those, but within each area of learning and experience, there are, of course, a different number of disciplines and subjects. So should the 6 areas of learning and experience and the statements of what matters be mandatory? Yeah, that's a really important part of what went through the passage of the bill through the Senedd. So when we mentioned earlier, the aspiration of Curriculum for Wales is those 4 purposes, and schools must design and then adopt and implement a curriculum. That curriculum must contain the 6 areas of learning experience and the elements set out in the code. So that's the statements of what matters, as well as the cross-curricular skills frameworks and mandatory curriculum elements that we'll mention in a moment. Okay, just a couple more and then we'll be finishing in time for some question and answers. Statements of what matters themselves are the basis for learners' progression. So this is now getting into quite granular things that we'd be discussing with practitioners, but the statements of what matters are really important. So they provide the structure for the curriculum design that's going to happen. And if I take one area of learning experience for an example for you, for expressive arts, there is 3 statements of what matters, 3 concepts that link the disciplines within expressive arts. So whether it be music or art or film or dance, they are interlinked by these 3 key concepts. And what you've got in Curriculum for Wales is that from age 3 right through to 16 for expressive arts, learners just learn through those 3 statements of what matters. If we were looking at the science AOLE, then we would be looking at 5 statements of what matters. So each AOLE has a different number, and the number doesn't stipulate any particular meaning other than each AOLE had to determine what really matters, what are the things that have to be learnt or understood. So it is really important that statements of what matters give the curriculum design process that the context that they need. And if you just have a look at that, it's about big ideas, concepts that allow learners to progress. But what's unique is that rather than a previous national curriculum that was based on coverage and getting through a load of content as quickly as possible to the next stage, then this is about depth of learning, spending the whole of your education learning just within and across 3 concepts, so that there's depth of learning, and then that pupils can make more links within and across their learning. And then progression steps. So if we imagine that we've got, I'll just leave those there for you to read. If we imagine from 3 to 16, for expressive arts, there are 3 main concepts. So there are descriptions of learning that try and describe what learning might look like in the earlier stages, in the middle, towards the end of a 16-year-old. But of course, they would be rambling descriptions if they weren't anchored down in some way. So progression steps are just ways of anchoring those descriptions of learning at key points. Now, the feeling with Curriculum for Wales was that we didn't want to anchor those down at yearly points, saying that by the end of nursery, all children should be able to do this, and then moving on. It's about individual learner progression. So the progression steps are really broad, so that actually a nursery child might progress way beyond what the previous national curriculum would have deemed appropriate just for 1 year. So it's really important. There's some more support for you on this in the governor assignment that we released when we went into the first lockdown back in April, and we were due to come out and see you across the local authorities, and we couldn't. So if you need to understand some of this, then we'll certainly pick it up with you at another point. This one often, I think it's really important to dispel this myth, actually, because a lot of the headlines, schools say, I don't want to plan the same as the school next door. Well, if we look at topics and themes, we might be talking more about lots of primary schools perhaps are used to doing topics and themes, so learning all of their key skills, learning all their knowledge through a topic on space or on dinosaurs or whatever it might be. But it's really important to know that schools don't have to plan through topics or themes. It's really appropriate at certain times where, you know, specific skills or pieces of knowledge are taught quite explicitly. But the schools within a cluster, when we talk to them about that model of Curriculum for Wales, the 3 circles, when they create their own curriculum, either as a school or across a cluster, those non-negotiables from which they will plan their classroom activities, then what we're saying is, let's have a look at what the common concepts, knowledge, skills and experiences might be across our cluster. And sometimes a cluster could be up to 15 schools that partner with a secondary. But is there a way of identifying some common, consistent concepts, knowledge, skills across that cluster that all of children would be exposed to in a certain order? And then, of course, it's up to each school, each individual classroom practitioner to decide how they bring that to life in terms of what topics, what themes, or if they teach all of their subjects discretely or not. They're all up for grabs in terms of discussions that need to be taken place with schools. And that's why the vision part of the work towards Curriculum for Wales is so important, because a school's vision might be for a very holistic, integrated curriculum where everything links across to each other. Or it may well be that actually some schools' vision is to maintain subjects and separate disciplines, and that they don't want to teach through topics and themes. These are all the sorts of discussions that need to be had, and they're the decisions that now are given over to schools to make. So we want to make sure they're as well informed and evidence informed as possible, and that's where then our professional learning comes in to support them. This is another one that links to the topics, really. There are many different ways to learn and to teach. And you, when you were pupils yourselves, you may have been taught in a disciplinary way. So you may have gone to a history lesson and learnt about history. You might have gone to an art lesson and just done your art. Or you might have had a more interdisciplinary approach where you might have learned about a particular topic. You might have learnt about the African slave route whilst you were in your music lesson, and whilst you were in your art lesson, and whilst you were in history. So you were still learning distinct discipline knowledge, but connected by a theme. Or you might learn everything integrated together through a topic. So there are so many different models to choose from, to approach for teaching and learning. And of course, what we're really keen to make sure is that no single method is prescribed within Curriculum for Wales. Natalie, did you want to come in there?
I was just going to say, what we focus on this, we are going to focus on this in our second module of and third module of curriculum design to support schools in this, because this is where we need to look at the theory before we look at the practice, and then we look at the practice and we look at those decisions the schools will make. So what is certainly the aspiration and vision of Curriculum for Wales is that schools look for those meaningful, authentic connections across disciplines, across subjects within AOLEs and across AOLEs. But how far they then plan that as a disciplinary, interdisciplinary, like Kath said, approach in their school is up to the theory and the practice and the model that they make as a school-based decision based on what they think would suit their learners and their staff and their whole school community best. But there is certainly an aspiration of finding those connections, identifying those connections, but they must be authentic, and those discussions and the research and the evaluation that will go on the impact that has for learning will be really important in every individual school. And again, that might be something you want to talk about as clusters as well, to look at how the schools across the cluster are approaching this.
And also developmentally appropriate. So, you know, they're taking into consideration child development, what we know of cognitive science, and just making sure that conversations are happening with subject leads, with subject experts to say, well, what is it for your subject to thrive within this setting? What type of approach would you advocate? And it doesn't mean that you have to be wedded to any one approach. We are going to be embarking now on a trialling and evaluating stage. The major thing is that if we are trialling, we are doing that within cycles of inquiry, where we trial and we evaluate and we refine, so that we make sure that we don't progress too far down one particular road without knowing that our standards have been maintained or improved.
And that might look different in different phases of a school, at different times of a school year, within even a different term. Things may be taught discreetly to start and then become more topic approached and connected once those skills and knowledge and experience are more embedded. So again, it's about practitioners really understanding curriculum design, curriculum theory, how we learn, child development, all those underpinning scientific theories that will support them in making the right choices for how they're going to approach a curriculum.
So this is another one, just the literacy numeracy framework has been around for some time now, and the digital competency. And they remain statutory, they're really important, considered now the shared responsibility of all practitioners. So if you are in a school that has a very discipline specific focus, so subjects are all taught by their own subject specialists, it is important that regardless of being a specialist, then all teachers still consider themselves teachers of literacy and numeracy and digital competence. They have to be embedded across, and the frameworks for those have been revised and are in line now with Curriculum for Wales. And then we're just looking at the last one. This is often one that even school practitioners struggle with. So what we constantly remember is age 3 to 16, that's the learning continuum. So Curriculum for Wales should serve our learners right up to 16. But what happens in most schools is that certainly by the time that our pupils reach year 8, they're having to consider what subjects they may want to study at GCSE or BTEC, or what qualification they want to do. So for year 9, often year 9, they've barely done maybe a year and a half of secondary school, of trialing these different subjects, and then they have to choose which 3 or 4 they want to study for GCSE. And what's happened over the years is that the curriculum for these young people has become more and more narrowed. So a really important part of Curriculum for Wales is that despite, you know, a child opting for further study in terms of a qualification, there has to be some learning in each area up to age 16 to keep a breadth there. So if I, as a 14-year-old, opted to take humanities GCSE and I wanted to also do the sciences, even though I hadn't opted for it, I still need to have some learning within expressive arts. I still need some learning within health and well-being. So it's really important. How schools do that is still very much in the early stages about talking about it, looking at what timetabling can allow and how timetable could free up the opportunity for this. But what is really key, the mandatory curriculum elements, right down here, you might not be able to see, of religion, values and ethics, so previously religious education or religious studies, relationships and sexuality education, Welsh and English, they are mandatory right the way through to 16, and the guidance is that some learning then in each area up to 16. So that's something we'll definitely pick up with you on at a later date when we look at perhaps qualifications and we start looking at, you know, what the top end of the continuum might look like, which is,
and like you said, Kath, there'll be some further guidance that comes out. Schools will start thinking about this, but in September 2022 we already talked at the start about that's the start of the implementation, and for secondary schools that's only year 7 then. So, you know, there are a few years where schools can be thinking, researching, discussing. Further work will be done in Welsh Government and in regional consortia to give schools guidance on what this might look like for those year 10 and 11 pupils.
So access there, if you like it, to the poster pack, which I mentioned earlier, and then just to end really to look at where schools can access support. And Natalie, shall I hand over to you for that?
Yeah, so we've had our Central South Wales Challenge since 2014, and you may have heard of SIGs, cluster working networks, and we offer a pot of money to all schools to support them in their collaborative activities. We have lots of professional learning offers. All of those are free for practitioners, governors, school leaders to access. So there is a wide offer there to support schools again with regard to curriculum. Specifically, the programme we've been talking about today is the Cross-Regional Professional Learning Programme. So we've just said the next phase of that now that we've just moved into is supporting schools in how to create time-based professional learning and curriculum design. And that will be the main focus of our programme for school leaders and middle leaders now for at least 2 terms. We have a number of events, resources, professional learning materials, and obviously we offer some bespoke support. So if individual clusters or networks or individual schools need additional support or something which is slightly different to what our general offer is, then they can contact us and we'll discuss and support where we can. So all of that is available through our website. So you know, you yourself can have full access to the website, all our practitioners. There's no login required. If you do log in, there is actually further information and resources, and a login is needed to book onto any professional learning.
And so just our website there, cscjes.org.uk, and there's the poster pack, but if you go here, you can find our Curriculum for Wales page, as well as information on the professional learning offer we have for our schools.